Richard Trenton Chase. His name might not be as well known as other infamous serial killers, but his crimes were no less horrifying. Richard Chase, born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California, would become known as the Vampire of Sacramento, and the name fit disturbingly well. Chase's gruesome murders, obsession with blood, and descent into madness are among the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But to understand how Richard Chase became one of the most terrifying serial killers of all time, we have to go back to his early years. Chase's childhood wasn't marked by any of the typical signs that would foreshadow his later crimes. However, as a young boy, he exhibited certain behaviors that, in retrospect, pointed to a disturbed mind. Chase grew up in a strict household with an abusive father. His parents' constant fighting and dysfunction likely contributed to his feelings of isolation and insecurity. He began wetting the bed well into his adolescence, one of the early signs in what psychologists refer to as the McDonald Triad, a theory that links childhood behavioral issues to future violent tendencies. Along with bedwetting, Chase also began showing cruelty to animals, another hallmark of this triad. As Chase entered his teenage years, his behavior became more erratic. He began to show signs of hypochondria, convinced that his body was failing him. He believed his heart would stop beating unless he consumed blood. This obsession would only deepen with time. As a young man, Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but rather than receive the sustained care he desperately needed, he fell through the cracks of the mental health system. By his early 20s, Chase had completely detached from reality. He became convinced that his blood was turning to powder and that aliens were controlling his body. His delusions drove him to violence against himself and animals. In one incident, Chase was found injecting himself with rabbit blood, which led to his hospitalization for blood poisoning. During his time in the mental institution, his obsession with blood and his belief that his life depended on consuming it earned him the nickname Dracula from the hospital staff. Yet, despite these clear signs of severe mental illness, Richard Chase was released back into society in 1976 after only a short stay in the institution. This would prove to be a devastating mistake. After his release, Chase's behavior became more erratic and dangerous. He began capturing small animals, rabbits, dogs, and cats, killing them and drinking their blood. He believed that by consuming the blood of animals, he could stave off the physical decay he was experiencing in his delusions. Chase would blend the organs of these animals into gruesome smoothies, which he drank as part of his deranged ritual. But soon, animals were no longer enough to satisfy his grotesque urges. In December 1977, Chase took the first step towards human murder. On December 29th, he killed his first victim, Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man, in a drive-by shooting. Chase later claimed he only fired the gun to release stress. The shooting was completely random and unprovoked, marking the beginning of his murderous spree. But this was only a precursor to the carnage that was yet to come. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase escalated to a new level of brutality. He entered the home of Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant. Chase shot her multiple times before mutilating her body in unspeakable ways. He removed several of her organs, drank her blood, and engaged in acts of necrophilia. The scene that authorities would later discover at Wallen's home was beyond gruesome, a true embodiment of horror. Just days later, Chase struck again, committing what would become one of the most disturbing and violent mass murders in Sacramento's history. On January 27, 1978, he entered the home of Evelyn Merath, a 38-year-old woman, and killed everyone inside. His victims included not only Evelyn, but her 6-year-old son, Jason, her 22-month-old nephew, David, and a family friend, Dan Meredith, who had stopped by to check on them. Once again, Chase mutilated the bodies and drank their blood, fully immersing himself in his vampiric delusions. In this instance, he took parts of the victims with him as he fled the scene. Chase's mental state had deteriorated so completely that he no longer distinguished between reality and his gruesome fantasies. His vampiric tendencies, obsession with blood, and cannibalistic urges had fully consumed him. However, his killing spree would not last much longer. Police quickly connected the murders to Chase after finding a trail of bloody footprints leading away from the crime scene and linking them to his previous encounters with local law enforcement. When the police arrived at Chase's apartment, what they found inside was like something out of a horror movie. The walls, floors, and even the refrigerator were covered in blood. There were jars filled with animal organs and bones scattered across the floor. Most horrifying of all were the blenders Chase had used to prepare his grisly smoothies of human and animal remains. Chase was arrested on the spot, offering no resistance to the authorities. During his trial, Chase's defense team attempted to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, citing his long history of mental illness and schizophrenia. However, the jury was unconvinced. Richard Chase was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death by gas chamber. Despite this, Chase never faced execution. On December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his prison cell after taking his own life by overdosing on his prescribed medication. The story of Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, is a harrowing tale of madness and murder. His crimes shocked the world not only because of their brutal nature, but because of the terrifying glimpse they offered into the mind of a man completely detached from reality. Chase's descent into violence was fueled by mental illness, untreated psychosis, and a system that failed to provide the care he desperately needed. But for his victims and their families, the horror was all too real. Richard Chase's name may not be as widely known as other serial killers, but his story remains one of the most chilling in true crime history. His legacy is a stark reminder of the dangers of untreated mental illness and the dark, violent depths to which it can lead.